July 16th, 1945, Camp Seagoville, Texas. The dust rose in small clouds with each step, the afternoon heat pressing down like a hand on the shoulders of every soul in the compound. Naoko Yamashita stood at the edge of the vegetable garden, her fingers gripping the handle of a rusted hoe, when she saw him approaching through the shimmer of heat waves. An American guard, young, maybe 22, with a weathered cowboy hat tilted back on his head and something wrapped in a cloth napkin tucked under his arm. He stopped at the fence line, smiled that easy Texas smile, and held out a tin of peaches. "You look like you could use something sweet, ma'am," he said, his drawl soft as the dust settling around his boots. Her training screamed at her to refuse, to turn away, to remember the oath she'd sworn in a concrete barracks half a world away. But her hand moved before her mind could stop it, reaching through the wire, fingers closing around the cool metal of the tin. And in that single gesture, something fundamental shifted. Not just in her, but in everything she thought she understood about war, honor, and what it meant to be human. If this story moves you the way it moved us, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a like on this video, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what part of this journey speaks to you. These are the forgotten voices of World War II, and every share helps keep their stories alive. Now let's go back to that moment in Texas when a tin of peaches became an act of quiet revolution. She had been trained to expect brutality. Every hour of indoctrination at the Auxiliary Training Center in Sapporo had reinforced the same message. Capture was worse than death. American soldiers were savages. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor. The instructors had been explicit, clinical even, describing in graphic detail what awaited those who fell into enemy hands. Better to die with honor than live in shame, they repeated until the words became part of the rhythm of breathing. Naoko had believed them because she had no reason not to, because doubt was not taught, only obedience. When the Americans breached the defensive line at Luzon in January 1945, chaos erupted like a dam breaking. She had been tending to wounded soldiers in a makeshift hospital, her hands stained with blood, her uniform soaked through with sweat and fear. The order came suddenly. Withdraw every soldier for themselves. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate, frozen by the weight of everything she'd been told. When the American soldiers appeared over the ridge, she knelt in the mud and waited for the violence she'd been promised. Instead, a medic approached, checked her for injuries, and asked in broken Japanese if she was hurt. That was the first crack in everything she knew. The transport to Texas lasted 3 weeks. Below deck with 47 other women, Naoko confronted an impossible truth. They were alive unharmed, treated with distant professionalism. Camp Seagoville, outside Dallas, surprised her wooden barracks, running water, gardens, casual guards. Spring turned the land green, painfully echoing home behind barbed wire. The first shower nearly broke her. Real hot water poured over her skin, lavender soap foaming in her hands, washing away weeks of grime and every story she'd been taught about the enemy. That night, on a warm mattress beneath a clean blanket, Naoko stared at the ceiling and felt something worse than fear, confusion. If this was cruelty, what had she been fighting for? The meals deepened it. Eggs and toast, soup with vegetables, rice, familiar and devastating. A kind cook sometimes added an extra spoonful. Naoko ate, guilt heavy with every bite, knowing her family was starving under the bombs. The other women resisted or wept or refused comfort altogether. No one spoke, but the question hung between them. How do you hate those who show mercy? Then came the cowboy. His name was Private James Jimmy Hollister, though Naoko wouldn't learn that until much later. He arrived at Camp Seagoville in early July, transferred from a combat unit that had seen action in the Pacific. Something about his demeanor marked him as different from the other guards. He moved with an unhurried confidence, leaning against fence posts like he'd grown up alongside them, chewing sunflower seeds and humming tunes that drifted across the compound like questions without answers. He wore his uniform the way other men wore work clothes, functional but not defining, and that battered cowboy hat seemed permanently tilted at an angle that suggested he'd never quite bought into military formality. The women noticed him immediately, though they pretended not to. In a world where every interaction with guards was carefully choreographed through layers of protocol and fear, his casualness was jarring. He didn't bark orders. He didn't march. When he passed groups of prisoners, he nodded and said, "Afternoon, ladies," as if they were neighbors sharing a street rather than captor and captive separated by war and wire. Naoko first spoke to him, if you could call it speaking, on that sweltering July afternoon in the garden. She'd been assigned to weeding detail, grateful for work that didn't require words or eye contact, just the simple rhythm of pulling unwanted growth from soil. The garden had become her refuge, a place where her hands could be useful without her mind needing to reconcile contradictions. She was kneeling between rows of tomato plants when his shadow fell across her work. "Hot one today," he said, more to the air than to her. She didn't respond, didn't look up, but her shoulders tensed. "These tomatoes coming in real nice," he continued, squatting down to examine the plants. "You got a good hand with growing things." Still she said nothing, though something in her chest tightened at the observation. No one had noticed her work, not as something worth commenting on. That's when he held out the tin of peaches. The moment stretched longer than physics should allow. The tin was ordinary, dented slightly, the label sun-faded and peeling at the corners. But in the charged air of that July afternoon, it became something else entirely. A question. A test. An offering that carried the weight of every lesson she'd ever been taught about pride, loyalty, and the unbridgeable distance between enemy peoples. Her hand reached through the fence before her mind approved the action. Her fingers closed around the cool metal. And in that instant, Naoko Yamashita broke protocol, not through defiance, but through the simple revolutionary act of accepting kindness from someone she was supposed to hate. "Thank you," she whispered in English, the words barely audible. Jimmy Hollister tipped his hat, smiled that easy smile, and walked away without ceremony, leaving her standing there with a tin of peaches and the sudden, dizzying realization that everything she'd been told might be a lie. That night, Naoko sat on her bunk, long after the other women had fallen asleep. The tin remained unopened in her lap, still cool despite the Texas heat. She traced the contours of the label with her fingertip, reading and rereading the English words she barely understood. California yellow cling peaches and heavy syrup. Each word was a small revolution, a tiny crack in the wall of certainty that had defined her entire adult life. One of the other women stirred in the darkness. "Did you take it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Naoko didn't answer at once. The question carried too much. Had she taken the food? accepted the gesture, betrayed what she'd been taught, chosen life where death was expected? Yes, she said at last. The word hung in the humid air like a confession. The other woman was silent, then barely audible. What did it feel like? Naoko thought of kindness from the enemy, of being seen as human by someone she'd been taught to hate, of a world cracking open, frightening and hopeful at once. Heavy, she said. It felt heavy. That night she opened the tin. The hiss of the seal sounded too loud in the barracks. Syrup caught the moonlight, glowing amber. She lifted a peach slice and tasted a sweetness that made her eyes burn, not because it was rare, but because it meant care, brief, impersonal, human. She cried then, quietly. Not for what she'd lost, though the loss was vast, but for what she was learning, that the world was more complex than enemy and ally, honor and shame. Kindness hurt in ways cruelty never did. It demanded she rebuild everything she believed. She began to suspect the real betrayal wasn't the peaches, but the lies about what it meant to be human. The next morning, Jimmy Hollister stood by the garden fence again. He didn't mention the tin. He leaned on the post, chewing sunflower seeds, and talked about Oklahoma skies, cattle drives, dust storms, about his sister braiding wildflowers, about falling off a bull into a water trough while the town laughed. Naoko worked the soil and listened. She didn't reply, but she listened closely. His stories felt truer than propaganda ever had. It became routine. Jimmy came each afternoon, sometimes with a small trinket, more often with stories. He asked for nothing. And slowly Naoko changed, first a soft posture, then a nod, and finally, after 3 weeks, a single word. Naoko. He asked her name as casually as the weather. The other guards watched. The women around her froze. The word rose in her throat like something locked away. Naoko, she said. Speaking it aloud felt like reclaiming something she hadn't known she'd lost. Jimmy smiled, careful with the sound. Naoko, that's real pretty. I'm Jimmy Hollister, folks call me Hoss. I can't ride worth a damn. The humor loosened something in her chest. Not a smile yet, but close. The beginning of trust. The garden became Naoko's center at Camp Segoville, the place where contradictions felt manageable. In the soil, under the sun, she didn't have to reconcile fences, war, or the ocean between her and home. She could tend living things and watch them grow. One afternoon in early August, Jimmy appeared at the fence and slid a paper packet through the wire. Inside were wildflower seeds, wrapped in newspaper. A note read, "Try these." They like sun. They were ordinary Texas flowers, but the gift carried an assumption of future sun, soil, time. Naoko planted them that evening as the other women watched. Some were wary, others watched with hunger. She pressed each seed into the earth with care. What if they don't grow? One woman asked. Naoko studied the soil. Then we'll know, she said. But right now we don't, so we wait. Waiting became its own discipline. Each morning she checked the plot. Days passed. Doubt returned. Perhaps nothing would grow. On the 8th day, a pale green shoot broke the surface. Then another. Within weeks, the plot was alive. The women began gathering each morning. One brought water. Another pulled weeds. They spoke little, but something passed between them, a reminder they were still capable of nurturing life. Jimmy watched from his post, never intruding. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he tipped his hat and moved on. The seeds had been his gift. The garden was theirs. By late August, yellow and orange blooms opened to the sun. Wild, unrefined, stubbornly alive, they changed everything. In those flowers, Naoko saw proof that survival was not shameful, that growth was not betrayal. Life, even here, still mattered. One evening, as the sky burned amber behind the barracks, Jimmy stood by the garden in silence, hat in his hands, turning it slowly as the flowers faced the fading light. My mama used to say, he finally spoke, voice quiet, that flowers are God's way of reminding us that tomorrow might be different than today. Naoko looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Not as a guard or an enemy or even as the cowboy with the easy smile, but as a person carrying his own weight of war and loss and hope. "Your mama was wise," she said in careful English, the words strange in her mouth but true. He smiled, small and sad. "She would have liked you. She always said the best people were the ones who could grow things in hard places." He put his hat back on, tipped it in that familiar gesture, and walked away. Naoko stood among the flowers as darkness gathered, feeling something shift deep inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, because there was still too much to process, too much horror and grief and rage. But perhaps the beginning of understanding, the recognition that the categories she'd been taught enemy and friend, honor and shame, victory and defeat, were insufficient to capture the complexity of human experience. The war ground on through August and into September. News filtered into the camp slowly, filtered through guards and newspapers, translated haltingly. Atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The women of Camp Segoville received this information in stunned silence, each processing the news through their own lens of loss and relief and guilt. Naoko thought of her mother in Yokohama, wondered if she was alive, wondered what remained of the city she'd left behind. The camp didn't change immediately with the war's end. The fences remained, the routines continued, the garden still needed tending. But something fundamental had shifted in the air, a loosening of tension, a sense that what came next was unknown, but possibly survivable. It was mid-September when Jimmy stopped appearing at his usual post. At first, Naoko told herself not to notice, to focus on the garden, on the flowers now in full bloom. But by the third day, concern had evolved into something sharper. She asked, trying to sound casual, if the cowboy guard had transferred. "Sent home," another guard replied. "War's over. They're processing discharges fast as they can. Sent home." Just like that, no goodbye, no final story about Oklahoma, no last tip of the hat. The absence hit harder than Naoko had expected, not because she'd come to depend on him, but because his presence had marked a turning point in her understanding of herself and the world. He had seen her as human when she'd been taught to believe the enemy couldn't. He had offered kindness when she'd been promised only cruelty. And in doing so, he'd given her permission to see herself differently, not as a failed soldier or a shameful prisoner, but as a person capable of growth, of change, of choosing life. The flowers kept blooming. Naoko tended them through September and into October. Even as the camp population slowly diminished, women repatriated in small groups. She watered and weeded and watched the petals open and close with the rhythm of days, finding in the routine a kind of peace she hadn't known was possible. In November, her name appeared on a repatriation list. She would return to Japan in 3 weeks, processed through San Francisco, and shipped across the Pacific to a homeland she barely recognized from the descriptions, filtering back through other returnees. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead or displaced, an occupation underway. Everything changed. On her final night at Camp Seagoville, Naoko sat in the garden beneath a vast Texas sky. The stars were unfamiliar, yet no longer strange. From her pocket she removed a pencil drawing of flowers sketched on the back of a mess hall menu by one of the women. She folded it carefully and placed it in her satchel beside a blanket and an unopened tin of peaches. She'd received other tins later and eaten them without thought. But this first one, the one that had unsettled her certainty and allowed something new to grow, remained sealed. She carried it through the months as a quiet talisman. The December 1945 train to Tokyo was slow and crowded, passing landscapes scarred by war. When Naoko reached Yokohama and found her mother alive, diminished but living in a shelter of salvaged wood, they embraced in silence, holding on as proof they still existed. The weeks that followed were about survival alone, finding food, hauling water, keeping out the cold. There was no space to reflect on Texas or kindness or change, only the next meal. The next day, at night, Naoko reached for the tin of peaches. She never opened it. It was no longer about fruit. It was proof that she had been seen, that kindness had existed even in captivity. She pinned the flower drawing beside her mat. When her mother asked about it, Naoko said simply, "I grew them in America, in a garden." Her mother asked no more. Naoko never saw Jimmy Hollister again. She never learned what became of the Oklahoma cowboy who offered peaches and planted something far more lasting. But she carried the lesson that kindness was courage, that humanity crossed borders, that growth was possible, even in hostile soil. Years later, her daughter asked about the rusted tin on their shelf. Naoko held it gently. "This," she said, "is what it looks like when someone sees you as human." Her daughter did not fully understand. She didn't need to. Naoko Yamashita died peacefully in 1998 at 73. Among her belongings were an unopened tin of California peaches and a pencil drawing of wildflowers. Today they sit in a small Yokohama museum labeled only "Personal Effects." War period. No explanation. Just objects that once meant everything and still do.